It's time to accelerate. Hey friends, this is Andy. Welcome to episode 621 of Accelerate, the sales podcast of record. Hey, I'm honored to be joined by my guest today on the show. Joining me is Tjan. Tony is the CEO and managing partner of Cueball Capital, which is a Boston-based venture firm. And he's author of a very interesting book titled Good People, the Only Leadership Decision That Really Matters. And we're going to dig into some of the major premises from Tony's book in today's conversation, including a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, which is why character matters. Our last episode in the show with Bridget, last week we talked about character. So as Tony cites in his book, fully 2/3 of employees are unhappy and unfulfilled at work, and only the third that remains, obviously, would recommend that their friends join their company they work for. I mean, it really boils down to an amazing lack of trust in institutions and in their leaders. And as Tony points out, leaders are taught competency, but not character. And he thinks that goodness, the quality of goodness, which is more than competency, it's our authenticity, it's your values, your character. It's what separates good leaders from those who aren't. And we're going to explore how to identify and hire the people that possess the right values and character and turn them into leaders who in turn can develop other leaders. It's a great conversation. I think you'll really enjoy. So make sure you stick around for that. If you'd like to see show notes for this episode, go to andypaul.com/621. And before I talk with Tony, let me remind you that if you haven't signed up yet to receive my periodic emails, then you're missing out. I save some of my best advice about sales, leadership, marketing, relationships, resilience, and character for my subscribers. So visit andypaul.com right now to subscribe. Right on the homepage there, you'll see a form, a little brief form. Just give us your email, and we'll get you on the list. All right, let's get to it. Tony Tjan, welcome to Accelerate.
Thank you.
So, I've got a standard question I open the show with these days. That tends to vary over time. But today's standard question is, in your mind, what's the single biggest challenge that faces sales reps today?
Well, I think the entire organizational structure is changing quite radically. By that, I think it used to be that it was fairly clear where you go to find, the person who has the money, the authority, and the need of any decision. As we go into more decentralized, more empowered organizations, I think trying to understand who your real customer is increasingly becomes challenging, and understanding in highly decentralized organizations where your offering or product that you're selling can have the greatest impact is perhaps harder than it was before. Ironically, we're now in a time with greater connectivity and in many ways greater modes of making inroads to organizations, but truly finding those leaders, those people who have accountability and authority, I don't think it's quite as straightforward if the trends continue at the most forward-thinking organizations.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just thinking about that for a second. Right. Yeah, good answer. So, yeah, I wish we had, you give me something to think about here. I'll come back to that as we go through the show, but,
well, I'll give an example.
Sure.
I'll give an example. So we've been fortunate, in my day job, I play the role as a venture capitalist in our firm Cueball, and in many cases, we become quite active with the portfolio companies. One example of a business that has grown substantively over nearly 10 years of becoming involved with it, Shape Up, that is now joined forces with Virgin Pulse. That's Richard Branson's Virgin. We are the leaders of corporate wellness in the organization. So what is corporate wellness? Well, in most self-insured organizations, they have some budget for wellness programs. Well, you say, okay, well, that seems fairly obvious. Well, at first you would say, okay, maybe I go to HR, and then within HR, I go to benefits. But I think what we found is what problem are we really solving, and who does that impact? And this ties maybe to a larger topic we will discuss, is wellness is something that is driving, especially in the millennial generation, engagement into organization. So engagement is about having people excited, motivated, willing to recommend their job to another friend. And yeah, generally speaking, that's in the HR office, but suddenly now you have a CEO issue or you have a department head issue. And who cares about engagement and selling at that higher level is likely different than someone who cares about wellness. And in every organization, it's slightly different. It's
Yes.
It's not the same. So it's not like you can have a playbook and say, okay, let me just, whip out the Fortune 500 list of, chief human resource officers and just call them. Because in some, it may be their decision. In others, it may fall into a department decision. In another, and you could say, well, that's kind of the same. But the thing that's changing in organizations, if you believe the theses of people like Stan McChrystal and Tony Hsieh and others that have written about systems thinking and systems organizations and information being disseminated, increasingly the most forward-thinking organizations are trying to put that decision-making at the point where someone has the most information. And, that it's not immediately clear who would have the best information as to what, the why, the how that drives engagement inside an organization, and that's so it's never as straightforward, I think, as we make it. I think as we move from kind of top down, pyramidal, command control organizations to more decentralized hierarchies of organizations, I think there's great benefits, but I think it's also not always clear who can make the decision.
Yeah, and I think the critical point you brought up is, and so what's happening in my reading of with the companies I work with and doing what I do is that, yeah, at the same time where it's becoming less obvious who that person is with the most information, is that companies are becoming more rigid with their implementation of their playbooks.
Right.
And so we've got this disconnect that's happening where, what we're doing is I see this with account-based sales, account-based marketing is we're selling to personas instead of selling to people.
That's exactly it. That's a better way of putting it.
And it's becoming, to me, it's reaching sort of a critical tipping point because, I think we have a generational issue where people aren't learning the skill that you were talking about is how do we find the person who, like I said, cares the most, has the most information. And I have my own example of that is I had a client worked with was one of the larger companies, sort of cover about half the United States, doing corporate delivery of meals. And this was a huge engagement issue, right, for employees. And they had, won't name names, but they had one of the largest tech companies around as one of their big clients. And they were making a push to say, we didn't want all the purchasing to be done so ad hoc, and some bigger of our clients, we wanted to try to get agreements, right? Some corporate commitments and so on. So in this particular company who was doing hundreds of thousands of dollars a month with them in business, sort of $30 at a time, they couldn't find out who the person was that was really making the decision. And what they ultimately found out was the admin to the CEO.
Well, there you go.
But
right?
Intuitively, no one would have thought that's the person, right? They thought there's got to be a VP level person somewhere. And if you go by the playbook and if you insist that you're going to sell to your personas, you're going to miss this completely.
I think that's so well put. I'm going to steal that line. I mean, my business partner always said when we're doing organizational design and looking for these things, whether it's sales or product development, you got to separate out the hat from the head. And it's easy to draw the hats. Sometimes you're not sure where the right heads and hearts are that match that hat. So
yeah, I like that too. I like that too.
You know, so heads and hats tend to be different things, and and that's the challenge. That's probably a better way to put it, because it's very easy to go and say, hey, there's that title, but where that actual authority or need or heart really lies is often in an organizational squeaky joint, right? Like,
yeah.
You're not sure, like, someone has delegated to someone who's delegated, and your example is brilliant. And sometimes that could be an admin, person. So that just doesn't. There's hundreds and hundreds of example. I'll give one last one really quick. In a prior career, like another Fortune 500, 40,000 employees, looking to really drive, customer research information for product development. So everyone is going out talking and looking head of product. This must be CEO. I mean, clearly this is information for head of product, and we don't really do that information. And when you go through the whole workflow, what you found out eventually for the CEO, where this CEO wanted to gather all his customer intelligence information, resided in customer service. Okay. In customer service, people at call centers, people like who were front of the line, and they were the research gathering body for the organization as almost centralized shared service. And you could spend a long time looking in the product department or department head. But that's not where it was. It was actually like your admin example, it's kind of intuitive, but how many organizations have that intuition and forward thinking to say, hey, the best place for me to collect customer research, and the place I would need tools to help organize and segment and distribute that is in our customer complaint department.
Yeah, very cool. All right, so let's talk about your book. You've written an excellent book called Good People, The Only Leadership Decision That Really Matters. And as you and I talked a little bit before we started the interview, is this is a topic that more and more people are writing about. Being good, creating cultures of good, caring, develop a level of caring. So why this book? Why now? What about this topic that really spurred you on?
Well, I think over the past decade, we've either seen a steady decline or a stagnation in cultural engagement in the workplace. Today in the U.S., you have a workforce population that is only 32% engaged. What that means, at best, only about 1/3 of your employees are happy to be at work and willing to recommend it to a friend as a place where they feel they have a meaningful role and are learning. The inverse of that is that 68% of the workforce today in America is either indifferent or wishing to leave their workplace. That's an astonishingly high number that has remained fairly steady over the last decade. Now, layered on top of that, over the last few years, you have seen the sharpest decline in institutional trust. We've seen it on a kind of media level and movement level, from things on Occupy Wall Street to, marches back into Washington, and all sorts of different levels of citizen engagement and protest. But from the workforce standpoint, the organizational body that has basically dip down to the lowest level of trust relative to government and media and NGOs is business. So in the business world, based on the Enablement Trust Barometer and others who have studied this, you're at best somewhere around high 40s in terms of being in a workplace that people actually trust. So when you go look at that and
what's sobering about that, as you said, that's the high point, right?
Yeah,
48%.
Right?
Every other institutions are lower than that, right? Our collective net promoter scores really suck.
Yeah, they really suck. And then I think going to some of the things you've written about and put out on your podcast, Andy, no different than trying to drive great sales or be a great leader. I think you can have a playbook of all just competency-based skills. And this was a similar conversation I had with the current dean of Harvard Business School that was help inspired part of writing the book. We've been very long on teaching leadership of competency, but fairly short on finding ways to teach leadership of character. And goodness is a word that people tend to be biased towards saying, hey, yeah, I'm good. Here's the competencies I have, skill 1, 2, and 3. But whether you're in sales, you're in marketing, you're in a CEO position, true leadership and true long-term effectiveness has to come from somewhere much deeper, much more authentic, and that is a lot about character and values. And I think that we're starting to recognize that being good is not just a nice to have. It actually is something that will drive long-term success. And the most successful companies, the most successful people, of course, they have that baseline of competency. But what really separates out those that are transformative, that create really breakout value, are those that can, go deeper and have a base of values and character.
Yeah, I mean, just to quote you from the book, you say, if you focus on the right people with the right values, the rest resolves itself.
Yep.
It seems like that's hard for people to come to accept, right? Given again, let's look at this age we're talking about. Yeah, not only we have sort of decentralization and wide dissemination of information across, let's say democratization of information throughout an organization, but we're also seemingly a little more enthralled to data, right?
Yep.
So it's like, people are measuring themselves by their activities and, these sort of very hollow numbers as opposed to something that has real value associated to it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, if there was a simple mantra to put forth outside of the good people mantra I write in my book, if you could drive towards just common values and common standards, that would be a pretty good business strategy for many companies. Can we get a set of common values in our people and common standards? It turns out that is much, much harder to do, because in a data-driven world, in a left brain thinking bias world, in a reward for competency world, we need to remember more than ever something so basic as, how do you put that human element back into it? And going back to some of those things we talked on sales, people can go through all the checklist, right? You can identify X, Y, here's the cadence, here's the flow, when do you do the close, yada, yada, yada. But really what I've found, it doesn't matter what role or you're playing, people who remember to be human and authentically help others become a fuller and higher expression of their inner selves, they're the ones that end up being the most successful, right? And
increasingly so, I believe. I mean, going forward, I think that in an environment where we're going to see increasing levels of, automation, AI, machine learning, not to overdo what it will be, but it's coming, right? It's going to be ever present, is this idea of being able to form human relationships is something that's outside the scope and province of a machine. And
I think you're going to see the revenge of being human.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think that if people can master, Jeff Colvin in his book, Humans Are
Yep.
Underrated, uses this term is we need to become more intensely human, and those of us who can stand a better chance of succeeding in the long run.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, and that's sort of interesting. You bring up this idea about how do we find these people, right? I mean, because that's really the hard thing. People have a hard enough time hiring for competence, let alone hiring for values. And you have, there's a professor from Yale that had published a piece in the New York Times over the last year talking about, research they're doing showing that when they're interviewing candidates for jobs, that actually there's a higher correlation to success on the job if they hired people without an interview, just based on their track record and their their resume, right, and their GPA. That interviews are sort of confusing things. So it's like, how do we put this together so people can hire people with the right values, bring the common set of values together?
Well, in my book, I have a chapter on how to become a better judge of people, and I don't disagree with that premise that was put forth in the Times. The response is not that we shouldn't interview. It is, how should we interview differently? And I think going back to what I said earlier, I think we have cultivated a bias for interviewing for competency. Now, most of those things, you're absolutely right, or this professor is. You could just check those boxes off of a resume and background checks and look at the person's track record there. I mean, there's not much value add in double clicking on many of those things. I mean, if the person went to this top Ivy League school, had this GPA, had this promotion track record, all of those things are fairly obvious things to see. So in the interviewing process, the question is, how do we really interview for those character-based or those elements of goodness? And that just requires a very different mental model and mindset to see if you are asking the right questions. So let me give an example, right? The example that I give often is when people are interviewing, they say, "Oh, okay, no, Tony. I asked them about the soft side. I asked them about their character." I said, "Well, what do you ask?" And probably the number one thing people say they ask, "Well, I want to get a little bit deeper. I really want to understand the person's greatest weakness," right? and so I said, "Great. Well, it turns out that there is a almost Pavlovian response to that question.
I'm sure.
Where people answer in one of three ways, right? Like the first is, Andy, I'd say my greatest weakness is, I'm too detail oriented. Yes. I think, that's probably it. If my workers had to point out one thing, is that I just really sometimes get a little too deep in those details. Then the second one is like, well, I've tried the work-life balance, but
I'm so glad you brought this up.
I think I really would say that my greatest weakness is there's just times I just work too hard. So, my strength is my weakness. I have a great work ethic, but sometimes, you're going to see when I work for you that I just work too hard. And then the third one, like the hallmark frickin' card of them all, is like, sometimes people just say I care too much. And so, you really haven't learned anything, because we have learned how to answer the questions to be asked.
Sure.
So people say, well, okay, what do you do? Well, you can do a couple of things. So I'll give one that is off interview and one that's on interview. If you don't want to do the interview, I would say, well, if you had a 2-hour block to really try to hire someone that was really important as executive leader, what we like to try to do with any of our CEOs is is minimally have a meal with them. But one of the things we put forward from one of our last partner discussions is, hey, can we try time to time, if someone's really, really important, why don't we invite them over to one of our homes or our office and let's cook a meal together. There's something, because one of my partners said, I said, well, who's very, very successful, has created multiple multi-billion-dollar businesses. And he said, the times I have learned the most about someone is, just cooking a meal together with them, sharing an experience. So it turns out it's not necessarily different from how you would, look at like evaluating on dating. You can go just by the data and the personal profile on something online. But if you want to get to know someone, you're probably not going to go on your first date. Can you please tell me what your greatest weakness is? Cooking a meal with someone. But I think Adam Bryant was from the New York Times gave a great pairing of questions when we discussed this topic. He said, well, perhaps the best questions he's heard from interviewing is asking people, if you had to just choose a single trait from your mother and from your father, what would it be and why? Now, what's the design point behind that question? Why does it get towards someone's goodness or real character? Is that basically the types of questions you should be asking are ones that help reveal as opposed to ones that provoke rehearsed. And if you think about that, you get questions like that. I think it's such a great question of like trying to figure out what single trait someone would want to have from each of their parents and why. It's an example of a question that, is not necessarily rehearsed.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So, well, let me ask you a question though, because you're a venture capitalist, and you've written a whole book about goodness as values, and I'm just sort of curious to get your thinking sort of in response to this almost seemingly weekly drumbeat of bad behavior being reported out of Silicon Valley. Venture funded companies, whether it's established big companies like Uber, or like Upload that they talked about last week in the New York Times, or social finance that's hit the paper with their.
Yeah.
So what's missing? Because part of the VCs, when you're making your investment decision, has to be who you're investing in, right? They always talk about we're investing in people, not the business. So what's missing in those instances?
I think it goes back to how you frame the type of leader you want. There are certain circumstances that I would say certainly warrant very strong command, control, pyramidal, authoritative systems. But by and large, especially in early stage companies, when you look at the trade-off that you can make if you want a egocentric top-down leader who is wanting to have as his or her metric as a barometer of success the number of followers they have, that is one modality. The other is what Tom Peters has said so eloquently many years ago, is that really true leaders are in the business of producing other leaders rather than followers. And I think that is the core and crux of the schism, of the issue in the Valley and other places, of what type of leadership at a most foundational level are you looking for? And my belief set and my premise is that long-term value and the most transformative value and the organizations that have the greatest retention, cultural engagement are ones where the leadership philosophy is one where the number one priority is when they say it's about people, they translate that into team building, which is translated into building leaders who build other leaders. Having people who know how to bring out the best in others by inspiring them to have the highest expression of their inner true self. And that becomes a very virtuous circle of positive culture. and a culture of trust, and one that goes beyond competency to a set of values that say that I have a duty, yes, to lead, but in doing that, that duty is to help serve. And it is as important to be that lifelong student as it is to be a teacher to others.
Yeah. And the point you had made before is not a cult of personality.
Exactly. So, what? Yeah, yes and no. So, generally speaking, I would say yes, but I think there's some pretty cultish, cool cultures out there that have formed because people generally care about each other.
Oh, sure,
and help each
They're
other.
But
I understand in the traditional, leadership persona, styles. Yeah, cult leadership of single point of failure. How do you spend time authentically trying to mentor, develop people, and have openness and transparency, and that's what's missing. I'd say the Valley has been way overly biased on competency, and it goes back to what we've talked about. We need to put the human factor back in there. We need to have an element of heart and emotion, which is ironically the core source of what gets many of these great businesses going. But it comes from the heart of a founder. Well, but we got to maintain that and scale that set of values and emotion, as opposed to letting that turn to ego and cult leadership and leaders who are just seeking followers.
Yeah, and you raised this question from Georges Doriot about you can have an A idea with C people or a C idea with A people, and you should invest in the latter as opposed to the former.
Yeah,
I mean, but does that scenario ever get presented to you? I mean, do you ever have a situation where you're investing and saying, yeah, I don't know about this idea, but this guy's hot, all right, or this woman is hot, in terms of their intelligence and their vision and their personality and their values. We want to invest in them, but this is not the idea.
Yeah, in fact, we're taking that. At our firm, we're founded with a human capital centric philosophy, meaning to be truly people first. And to be people first, in any decision you make, you think about, well, how does that impact the other people? What does this say about the person's character and ability? And our most extreme version of it actually came this week so we have not just a weekly deal pipeline, which is maybe more idea bias. We have a weekly people pipeline, where we review the people that we should try to get to know in our ecosystem or cultivate relationships. And this week, an idea was put forth by some of my colleagues, which I'm embracing, which is, look, we should just put down this set of people in our entire relationship ecosystem where we should just make sure they know it doesn't matter what idea they have. Whenever they're ready to start something, we're going to back them regardless, because we believe in their combination of competency, but we really believe in their character, ability to be self-aware, to listen, to imprint goodness on others. They represent the highest level of integrity, but by extension, leadership potential. And that's the extreme version. So the answer is not only yes. We've seen things where I'd say it hasn't been like totally off the deep end of a idea that is just complete crap and should go into sink disposal. But I think it's like there've been times where all of us sat around the table, including with the entrepreneur, and said, we're all collectively not sure what this is, but we just have such deep belief in your general theme and more important, who you are, that we should just back you. And we have.
Interesting. Love it.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of the show, but I do want to just finish with a quote, which I really love from the book from General Schwarzkopf, Norman Schwarzkopf, Desert Storm fame. He said, he remarked about leadership. Leadership is the potent combination of strategy and character, but if you must be without one, be without strategy.
Ditto that.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, Tony. So great to have you on the show. Tell people how they can connect with you and learn more about what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot, Andy. Well, for the Good People book, obviously go to any major online bookseller or aboutgoodpeople.com. In terms of connecting to me directly, you can find all the information at my firm's website, which is at cueball.com, CUEBALL.com. And my last name is spelled T like Tom, JAN. But as you've done, pronounce Chan.
You trained me well. So, Tony, again, thanks for being on the show. And friends, thank you for spending this time with me today. Make sure you come back, join me for our next excellent episode of Accelerate. Until then, if you get a chance, really appreciate you. Go to iTunes, wherever you listen to this podcast, subscribe, leave us a review. We want to hear what we can do to make this a better experience for you. So until next time, this is Andy Paul. Good selling, everyone.